Alright, good morning everyone. This is Generic Fool's Test. I am sorry for starting the stream a little bit later than normal. I am going to react to another Paper Skies video, since my normal viewers are not normally available today at this time, or like for a little while. I'm going to just cover military stuff. So this is when the Soviet Navy lost 16 admirals in a single accident. The I can just go here. The Tu-104 crash at Pushkin. All right, let's begin.
February 7, 1981, the Tupolev Tu-104 from the 25th Naval Aviation Division of the Soviet Pacific Fleet lined up on the main runway of the military airfield Pushkin and prepared to take off. It was a normal winter day with a slight crosswind and a little snow, but nothing serious enough to cancel the flight. As soon as permission to take off was granted, the aircraft began the run and soon lifted into the air. But just 8 seconds after the aircraft became airborne, all of a sudden the Tu-104 crashed into the ground 1,500 meters from the end of the runway. The huge explosion that followed left no survivors among those on board the aircraft. For the Soviet jetliners Tupolev Tu-104, the disaster at Pushkin Airfield became the very last accident in their history, after which they were permanently retired from service. But the main reason the tragedy at Pushkin Airfield went down in history was not because it had ended the career of the first Soviet commercial jetliner, but because the single crash had almost entirely beheaded the Soviet Pacific Fleet. And that day, in just a few seconds, the Soviet Navy lost 16 admirals and generals, including the commander of the Pacific Fleet himself.
Can you imagine that? And that's why oftentimes leadership doesn't ride all in a single aircraft or all in a single car. Because, it's a problem if all of a sudden everyone in charge is dead. Or even if half the people in charge die.
Whether you like it or not, but people who serve in the armed forces are not exactly equal. At least not in the way we have become used to in civil organizations. In its very essence, armed forces, no matter the country, are a strong hierarchical system, and one person's value within the system is reflected by their military rank. Sure, there always will be some exceptions, but as a general rule, the high-ranking officers possess higher-level skills and expertise, which make them more valuable in comparison to the lower-ranking.
Well, it also depends. In certain countries, they prefer you to be loyal to the government or to a political party over their own, competency. And the problem with that is, the main reason certain countries do that is because they're afraid of a outstanding military hero coming out of nowhere and essentially, becoming a hero of the people and overthrowing their power or position. So they tend to put people who are loyalty over competency.
Thus, for the armed forces, the loss of the high-ranking officers is always an exceptional occurrence, since the effect of such a loss will always have a negative, if not devastating effect. But it is one thing when the commanders are lost due to enemy actions, like for example the death of Hisoroku Yamamoto as a result of the exceptional operation by the US Army Air Force, and it is quite another when the enemy has nothing to do with it. And there may be a minor difference if the reason was due to a bad weather, a human error, or a freak accident, like for instance the death of Romanian Major General Alexandru Ioanitu, who was walking around on the airfield waiting for his plane to get ready, and while being lost in thought, accidentally stepped into the aircraft's rotating propeller. But
oh my god, really? Serious? Oh Jesus. Aircraft engines are pretty loud. How do you... And on top of that, how is it that nobody is around to notice the general doing that?
Arguably nothing can compare it to the accident that happened in the Soviet Union in 1981, when just a single airplane crash killed 44 Navy servicemen, including the commander of the Soviet Pacific Fleet, Admiral Emil Spiridonov. The awful accident itself was already an enormous blow for the Soviet Navy, but finding out the reasons that caused the accident simply doubled the shock of the tragedy itself. On February 1st, 1981, the high-ranking officers of the main Soviet fleets arrived in Leningrad for an annual general meeting. During the whole week that followed, the fleet commanders were reporting about the current condition and readiness of their fleets to hold the fight against the evil capitalist bloodsuckers. Based on the reports, the admiral of the fleet of the Soviet Union, Sergei Gorshkov, pointed out that among all the Soviet fleets, the highest level of proficiency and competence was demonstrated by the command of the Pacific Fleet. Since it was one of the most important and powerful fleets in the Soviet Navy, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Spiridonov, and his officers received personal gratitude from Admiral Gorshkov for such an outstanding service. Being acknowledged by the chief commander himself was a great honor, so the Pacific Fleet officers, despite the upcoming long flight to Vladivostok, to the very east of the Soviet Union, were in a great mood. Although Pushkin was a military airfield, on February 7th it was a bit crowded in the airport's departure area.
Okay, so in addition to losing half of their naval command, the half of their naval command that they lost are supposedly the most competent of their naval command. Jesus.
Navy admirals, army generals, and various Communist Party officials were there, still discussing with excitement the results of the general meeting they took part in. There was even a special outdoor area cleared of snow made for them so they could better observe the departing airplanes. According to eyewitnesses, everything that day looked quite ordinary, except maybe the takeoff run of the Pacific Fleet's Tu-104 that seemed to take a bit longer than usual, but in the end the plane nevertheless took off in the air. But as they recalled later, the aircraft, instead of slowly decreasing in size as it would normally do while flying away from the airfield, suddenly hung ominously in the blue sky like a huge cross, and then, rolling to the right, crashed on the ground. A huge explosion then rose into the sky. The aircraft's fuel tanks were fully loaded for the long flight, and 30 tons of jet fuel, after exploding, were fiercely burning for yet another hour. The crowd in the departure area rushed through the deep snow to the crash site, but the strong flames did not allow them to approach the wreckage and help the passengers and the crew in any way. Only one person was found alive, having been thrown out of the cockpit through the glass in the nose of the aircraft. Unfortunately, the severeness of his injuries didn't leave him any chance of survival, and he died on the way to the hospital. The plane crash killed all 50 people on board, among which were 12 colonels and captains of the first rank, as well as 16 admirals and generals, including the commander of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Emil Spiridonov. At first, it was simply impossible to believe what had happened. To better understand the extent of the tragedy, during all the years of World War II, the USSR lost only 4 admirals, 6 years of war, and 4 admirals. And here, in just a blink of an eye, 16. In a single moment, the Soviet Navy lost almost the entire command of the Pacific Fleet. It was an unbelievable loss for the Soviet Navy, and the first reaction in the headquarters was, "It's a war." The Soviets decided that the plane was destroyed as a result of the enemy's special operation to kill all the commanding officers so that the Pacific Fleet wouldn't be able to withhold the powerful attack that would obviously be coming soon. So the very next moment, all Soviet military units in the Pacific were put on full alert, ready to meet the enemy. But time was passing and the enemy was not coming. While the Pacific Fleet was waiting for a fight and the soldiers of the Pushkin Airfield Guard were searching nearby woods and fields for any top-secret documents that might have flown away from the crash site, the Soviet Navy command realized more and more clearly that the possibility of the enemy bringing the explosives to the heavily guarded military airfield, where every soldier went through a thorough verification process, was extremely low. So the conclusion was made: if the plane crash wasn't from the actions from the outside, it was from the inside then. An internal sabotage. One of our own set the crash. Someone who would benefit from the death of the Pacific Fleet commander. To take his place, for example. But who? All of Admiral Spiridonov's deputies died with him in the plane crash. Or did they? When checking the passenger list, it was suddenly found that Vice Admiral Rudolf Golosov, the Chief of Staff of the Pacific Fleet and the first candidate to replace Admiral Spiridonov, was not on board the crashed plane. It turned out that at the very last moment, Golosov refused to fly with Admiral Spiridonov and the rest of the officers. Was it because Golosov knew the plane would crash? And where is he? Admiral Golosov didn't board the plane, but he couldn't be found at the Pushkin airfield either. For a moment, it seemed that investigators had caught a promising trace. Although Vice Admiral Golosov indeed didn't fly on the plane to Vladivostok, it became clear relatively quickly that he had nothing to do with the crash. The thing is that Rudolf Golosov, before being transferred to the Pacific Fleet, had served for some time in the command of the Northern Fleet, and his daughter still lived there with her family. Taking advantage of attending the meeting in Leningrad, the Vice Admiral asked his commander Admiral Spiridonov, way ahead of the trip, for permission to visit his daughter during the weekend after the meeting, and then he would return to Vladivostok by taking the commercial flight. Admiral Spiridonov replied that it would all depend on the results of the general meeting, and he would give his decision then. Since the meeting was a big success, Spiridonov allowed Golosov to visit his daughter, but their final conversation was just a couple of hours before the disaster, and that is why Vice Admiral Golosov was still on the passenger list. In the morning of February 7th, Golosov flew to the Murmansk together with the command of the Northern Fleet, not even realizing that it saved his life. As he later recalled in his book, while in the middle of the 4-hour drive to the small town to meet his daughter, a police car caught up to him asking to return immediately to the Northern Fleet headquarters. Golosov spoke with Admiral Gorshkov over the phone, and it was a huge shock for him when he learned that all his comrades had died in the plane crash. The shock was no less when his friend, who worked in counterintelligence, privately told him later that for some time Golosov had seriously been considered as a suspect in the death of the Pacific Fleet command. But if the enemy had nothing to do with the crash and it was not sabotaged, what was it then? Airplane malfunction? Human
Oh my god, what could it be?
error? But that would be impossible since the Soviet pilots don't make mistakes and the Soviet airplanes are the most reliable in the world, at least officially. But the data from the aircraft's black box seemed to bluntly ignore the desires of the Soviet propaganda. From the point of safety and reliability, the Tupolev Tu-104, which the command of the Pacific Fleet used to fly on, was certainly not the best choice, to put it mildly. Very mildly. Developed in record time, the first Soviet jetliner, the Tupolev Tu-104, was of course a huge technological accomplishment for the Soviet Union. But the Russian development, driven more by political rather than rational decisions, led the plane to have a long list of flaws. Sure, when building something that is the very first of its kind, mistakes are almost inevitable. That's just a normal part of technological progress. But the problem was that being fully aware of all the Tu-104 flaws and the aircraft's extremely awful accident rate, in fact the worst among all the Soviet commercial airplanes that ever existed, the Soviet government stubbornly refused to retire the aircraft from service. Although the production of the aircraft was cancelled in 1960, the Tupolev Tu-104 continued to fly for more than 20 years, regularly enlarging the death toll of its victims. The last straw for civil aviation was the aircraft disaster in March 1979, when yet another Tu-104 crashed not far from Moscow and the aircraft was then removed from service. But not entirely. The Soviet military decided to keep their Tu-104s. But the thing is that even the military Tu-104s being used at the beginning of the 1980s, from a technological perspective, differed little to nothing from the late 1950s when those planes were built and put into service. Poor radio and navigation equipment, multiple technological flaws, heavy on controls, the Tupolev Tu-104 has always been a difficult aircraft to fly, whose safety largely depended not on the airplane performance itself, but rather on the skills and experience of any particular aircrew. Going back to the disaster at Pushkin, perhaps at the time it was difficult to find a better fit for the old Tu-104 than Lieutenant Colonel Anatoly Ilyushin. More than 8,000 flight hours in total, almost 6,000 of which were on the Tupolev Tu-104. Highly experienced pilot Anatoly Ilyushin for several years was the captain of the airplane that carried the command of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. So was the crash at Pushkin his fault? The problem is that, like most of the accidents in the Soviet Union, whether civil or military, the disaster in Pushkin was immediately classified. Only the general conclusion of the investigation conducted by the Ministry of Defense, released almost 2 years after the accident, was more or less official. One of the official conclusions was that the plane became airborne at a speed of 40 km per hour less than the required takeoff speed. But is it possible that Ilyushin, who had 17 years of flight experience on the Tu-104, had made such a stupid mistake? Moreover, why didn't the co-pilot or anyone else in the cockpit notice that and prevent the fatal mistake? According to the flight regulations, while on the takeoff run, the Tu-104 pilot must reach the speed of at least 220 km per hour and then slowly raise the nose of the aircraft by 6 degrees. After completing the initial pitch of the nose gear, the Tu-104 would get airborne on its own and would gradually continue to climb. But according to Admiral Golosov, something weird happened during the Tu-104's takeoff at Pushkin. In his book, Golosov claims that the commander of the Soviet Naval Aviation, General Mironenko, showed him the data from the aircraft's black box after the investigation was complete. The flight recorder indeed had registered that the aircraft took off at a speed of 185 kilometers per hour instead of the required 220. But what is interesting is that the aircraft's angle of attack was much higher than the required 6 degrees, and even more importantly, the flight recorder did not register any pressure on the yokes when the Tu-104 got airborne. In simple
So how did it happen?
words, according to Golosov, it was not the pilot who lifted the plane into the air. But if it was not Ilyushin, then who or what?
A sausage plane. Ooh, boy.
When trying to understand the reasons behind pretty much any event that happened in the Soviet Union, it is always important to understand the, let's call it, peculiarities of life in the USSR. The Soviet Union was in every sense quite an unusual country. Thus, for most of the people who were fortunate to be born outside of the USSR, some events might make no sense at all. In fact, one might say that making no sense would be one of the main peculiarities of the Soviet Union. Sure, from a scientific and technological perspective,
Learning about it is so interesting because of all the weirdness and peculiarities that exist about it, but
the
either way.
USSR was indeed one of the most powerful countries in the world. Make no mistake, the list of technological achievements of the Soviet Union is impressive in comparison to any of the countries that existed at the time. But when making the conclusion about the greatness of the USSR, it is quite often that people forget or simply are not aware of the price that ordinary Soviet citizens had to pay for such greatness. The impressive list of technological accomplishments made by the greatest country in the world, as most of the Russians still think, would make a completely different impression if, for example, you start adding some.
Despite only 28% of respondents said they would want to return to the path the Soviet Union was following. 58 said they'd support Russia in Russia's own special way, and 10% said they preferred the European path of development.
Other, less impressive achievements that most of you won't even think of since they have been taken for granted. Like, for example, the year 1969, when the Soviet Union launched the first factory producing toilet paper. So the greatest country in the world had
And what a year to produce toilet paper. 1969.
already built and tested nuclear bomb, launched the Sputnik, completed the first manned journey into outer space, built the first supersonic jetliner, but still couldn't produce toilet paper. And 1969 was not the year of solving the problem of toilet paper, but just the year of launching a single factory in a country with a population of 130 million people. To be fair, the availability of toilet paper in the Soviet Union has always been an issue until the very last day of the existence of the USSR, making it yet another item in the long list of the so-called deficit goods, a word familiar to every Soviet citizen no matter the age or place of birth. A catastrophically ineffective Soviet economy led to the situation that most of the consumer goods were either non-existent or were poor quality, and even those most of the time would be either hard or even impossible to buy. That applied to pretty much everything, whether it's a car, TV set, furniture, shoes, or even food. Of course, for the high-ranking Communist Party members, this problem didn't exist, since they received the deficit goods from the special stores, which regular citizens were not allowed in. The Soviet people were joking that the USSR was the only country in the world where everyone is equal. It's just some people are more equal than others.
Yes.
The situation with the availability of consumer goods in the stores was somewhat better in large cities such as Moscow, Leningrad, or Kiev, but for the remaining 90% of the country, the situation was simply awful. When trying to get some deficit products, it was quite often that the Soviet people had to take a train and travel to, let's say, Moscow to do groceries. There was even a popular riddle in the Soviet time. What is long, green, and smells like sausage? The answer is a passenger train. The thing is that the travelers returning from Moscow with bags packed with various food items, most of the time sausages, provided passenger cars with quite peculiar and distinctive smell. That is why these trains were often called sausage trains. And I'm talking here not about Moscow's suburbs, but about the cities that are more than 1,000 kilometers away, such as Kursk or Samara. Just so you understand, population-wise, those are cities that are comparable to Miami and Manchester. So going back to the Pushkin airfield in 1981, one might say that the military Tu-104 with Navy officers who flew from the far east of the Soviet Union to Leningrad was in a way a sausage plane.
Ah, yes.
While working through the version of the pilot's mistake that possibly caused the crash of the Tu-104, it was discovered all of a sudden that Lieutenant Colonel Anatoly Ilyushin, the pilot of the Admirals airplane, long before the disaster at Pushkin had sent a complaint to the political department of the Soviet Navy, reporting that his plane was constantly flying overloaded while transporting furniture, refrigerators, washers, china sets, and even...
So you see, there was a reason for the previous thing being brought up. And actually, I'll be right back. I just need to do one thing quickly. Sorry about that. I was just getting some water.
spare parts for the Admirals Moskvich, but Ilyushin's complaint remained unanswered. Nobody dared to question Admiral Spiridonov. Such facts, as well as the testimony of some eyewitnesses at Pushkin, were signaling more and more clearly about the cause of the disaster, which many had thought of from the very beginning, but didn't dare to voice it. The fact is that the officers of the Pacific Fleet decided to take full advantage of their working trip to the so-called second capital of the Soviet Union. Of course, such a trip for them was not the first, but this time the shopping tour, for some unknown reasons, completely spiraled out of control. As General Viktor Sakharin recalled after the crash, the mess when loading the aircraft was pure chaos. A bunch of admirals giving commands to load their multiple purchases, the aircrew trying to bring the loading process into order, but admirals rudely telling the pilots that they are just drivers here and they should know their place. The co-pilot and the captain argued again, after which several admirals had fired, deranked, retired, and verbally humiliated the pilots. Who is a co-pilot for the Soviet admiral? Nothing, just an insect, even the captain of the airplane, albeit a lieutenant colonel. Moreover, the commanders rarely flew home from the meetings sober. Admirals shoved in the airplane everything they were able to find and buy in Leningrad, starting with the furniture, TVs, ceiling lamps, china, and ending with regular oranges. According to some accounts, as a result, the aircraft became heavily overloaded. But to make it even worse because of the disorder while loading, the cargo was placed in the aircraft unevenly, overloading the rear part of the plane, which in turn shifted the center of gravity to the rear. Of course, today it is impossible to find out why the captain of the aircraft agreed to take off in such conditions. As General Sakharin once said, it's hard to say what would have happened to Anatoly Ilyushin and his aircrew had he refused to fly. I suppose that in the best case scenario, all the aircrew members would become retirees right on the airplane. And it is hard to disagree with him. High-ranking officers in the Soviet Army and Navy had powers so great that they indeed could ruin someone's career or even life in an instant. General Sakharin believed that the pilot, knowing about the overweight, probably hoped that he would be able to keep the aircraft on the takeoff run in a three-point position until the required takeoff speed or even slightly higher, after which he would carefully raise the nose of the aircraft, and with a small angle of attack and a speed higher than required, he would be able to slowly lift the aircraft in the air. There was roughly a 10% margin in the possible shifting of the Tu-104 center of gravity before the critical levels on which the plane becomes uncontrolled. According to General Sakharin, it's difficult, but they had to perform such a takeoff from time to time when their Tu-16 bombers were overweight, which were quite similar to Tu-104. And he thinks that Ilyushin was hoping to deceive the wrongly loaded cargo by using such a takeoff technique. But there was another thing. Right before the flight, Admiral Spiridonov managed to get 2 huge rolls of printing paper for the Pacific Fleet's newspaper. Each roll weighed roughly 500 kilograms. It is believed that these rolls, when loaded on board, were not properly secured, and during the acceleration on the takeoff run, they all of a sudden rolled back in the cargo bay, shifting the aircraft's center of gravity.
There's your problem. Oh, man.
further to the rear into the critically dangerous level. As a result of this rapid shift, the aircraft raised the nose itself, which in turn created the lift on the wings sufficient enough to get the aircraft airborne. But due to insufficient speed and high angle of attack, the plane stalled and a few seconds later fell to the ground. Unfortunately, there is nothing that the pilots could do in such a situation. As Admiral Golosov wrote in his book, officers jumped into the cars and rushed to the crash site. Alas, the heat of blazing jet fuel did not let them get closer. Bright orange flames quickly devoured the remains of the people. Only the oranges remained alive, rolling out from the burning debris, brightly orange like little shards of the flame. All 50 people on board were killed as a result of the plane crash. 44 of them were Navy servicemen and 6 were civilians. Among them was Admiral Spiridonov's wife and some other people whom Admiral Spiridonov allowed to fly on his plane, which was a flagrant violation of the Minister of Defense order that strictly prohibited civilians from flying on military flights. But apparently Admiral Spiridonov here again decided that rules are not for admirals.
Yeah. I mean, that's why there's a problem when your people in power abuse their power.
Soon after the accident, the main Soviet military newspaper Red Star published a small note far in the corner on the third page saying that the group of the Soviet admirals, officers and other servicemen of the Pacific Fleet died in the air crash. The Ministry of Defense and Political Department of the Soviet Army and Navy expressed condolences to the relatives of the perished. The note also listed the names of 3 admirals who died in the crash. And that's all, nothing more than that. The Soviet Union didn't even notice the loss of 50 people. Like most of the accidents in the USSR, the disaster in Pushkin was immediately classified and remains so to this day. Most of the perished in the accident were quietly buried in a common grave in Leningrad, where a small memorial was later erected. Interestingly enough, the widows of the Navy officers received an official notice of the deaths of their husbands only in 1997, 6 years after the Soviet Union had collapsed. And a year later, in 1998, to the inscription on the...
Isn't that great? Wondering where your husbands and family are, and only to learn 6 years after they disappeared that, oh, they all died in a plane crash and we've known for a while. Isn't that excellent?
Memorial saying to Navy servicemen of the Pacific Fleet was added who died serving on duty on February 7, 1981. Of course, no one would like the inscription on the memorial saying to servicemen who died while doing groceries. But the problem is that such an approach and total secrecy significantly reduce the chances of learning from mistakes, which doesn't help by any means to avoid such accidents in the future.
Yeah, how exactly are you supposed to learn from your mistakes if you keep every time you have them happen, you're like, that didn't happen, nuh-uh. They're just doomed to repeat the same stupid mistake over and over and over again.
With the total secrecy in the USSR and then Russian Federation, it's hard to say how many similar accidents had occurred since. Unfortunately, we only know about those that were impossible to hide. Like for example the 1996 crash of the military aircraft Antonov An-12, in which 17 people died, including the commander of the Leningrad military district, General Sergei Seleznov. It is believed that the cause of the disaster was that the aircrew was forced by the general to take off in the overloaded plane in harsh weather conditions. The crashed aircraft, in addition to the military cargo, was also transporting various construction materials for the General Seleznov's house as well as his personal car. It is well known that obtaining enormous power may blind and change people. Unfortunately, when it comes to the USSR and modern Russia, it is quite often that this problem gets to the extent that those possessing powers not only reject the basic rules of human ethics, but even the laws of physics. And the worst part is that most of the time the final bill for such negligence is not only paid by themselves, but shared with innocent people too. And that's this story. If you like aviation and stories like...
You should check out their, well, I'm going to watch another video from him, so you're going to be able to see his channel thing afterwards. I guess I'll cover another one. 1 second. This video is shorter, so I should be able to cover it before I have to leave for work. Alright, 1 second, just going to add this thing to Twitch. I'm going to Twitter or X. Sorry about that. I was just reacting to. I mean, I was just typing in stuff for people who are, so that other people know on Twitter/X, and also changing the title of the video. Without further ado, we'll get started. Now, this was made a year ago, so it was a while ago in the history of the Ukraine war. That's as of this moment still going on.
Years since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a long year full of pain, suffering, and loss for millions of Ukrainians, and also a year of regular bravura reports by the Russian Air Force on the destruction of various Ukrainian military targets, which in reality were mostly residential buildings and civilian infrastructure. I could talk all day about the Russians, whether military or so-called ordinary people who find vigorous delight in regards to the death of Ukrainian civilians, but this is aviation history and not the world of...
Also, for those who don't know, Paper Skies is a Ukrainian. He was born in the Soviet Union when it existed, but he was only there for the final days of it. His father was actually a pilot in the Air Force, and that's one of the reasons why he has such a large interest in aircraft. So if you want to learn more about Soviet aircraft, you should watch his channel, Paper Skies, and you should also check Nebula, which is, I'll show the little ad of it at the very end of this.
Animals channel. Therefore, I want to draw your attention to something else. If you have been following the news of this war, you may have noticed that among all the houses, hospitals, and schools destroyed by the Russian missiles in Ukraine, there were also a number of hits on ordinary outdoor toilets. Of course, you may think that those hits were nothing more than just a weird coincidence. It is also fair to think that those news stories could have been just simple fakes created so to mock the Russians. Indeed, it's hard to imagine that the Russian precision-guided Ha-29 missile, worth over $250,000, would somehow lock onto someone's outdoor cottage toilet, which is basically nothing more than a lone standing plastic or wooden box with a small path leading to it. But if I tell you the story of how the Russians back in the 70s used a yellow sand road to cheat on the Ha-29 missile trials, then probably the 2022 Ha-29 toilet hits in Ukraine will no longer look that extraordinary. When speaking about Russian weapon technologies, the modern examples of which are usually just upgraded versions of Soviet-era developments, it is almost impossible to avoid the matter of the Russians copying Western technologies. The Russians usually prefer to either simply ignore these accusations or say that there is nothing wrong with copying.
Sure.
Everybody does it. Even the Americans themselves sometimes copied the Russians, which, to be fair, is somewhat true, though the main difference is that the Russian military which copies Americans exists in real life, while the American military which copies the Russians is mainly in Hollywood movies. In 1998, the HBO network released a comedy film called The Pentagon Wars. The opening scene of the movie,
Which, The Pentagon Wars, is a book written by a salty bastard who, tries to portray himself as a hero when he's really just whining and, There's a channel called Laserpig you should check out, and it will cover the Pentagon Wars. People treat it like it's fact, but if you look into the details, everything stated in the book is complete and utter nonsense. And the guy who's complaining has, one, an axe to grind, which is always a great thing, and then two, doesn't understand what he complains about, why people did the things he's complaining about, and acts like it's, cheating, when it has very clear purposes for helping make a vehicle better.
pictures
But,
before the house.
People act like he's a hero or something, but, there's a reason why the man refuses to talk to anyone, because he knows he's full of shit.
Armed Service Committee, where General Partridge, played by Kelsey Grammer, is accused of using various tricks and gimmicks so faulty weapons could pass military trials. One such trick was the general ordering electric hot plates to be taped to the surface of an armored vehicle so to help the heat-seeking missile find its target. It is indeed a hilarious episode that could hardly be imagined happening in real life, but there is always Russia. The thing is that the funny episode created for this American comedy greatly reminds one of a real-life episode of the Soviet military cheating while...
Yeah, as I said, the Pentagon Wars has no real... The thing technically happened, but basically then what actually occurred in the military is they act like the military was forced to let him do it, when he was like, I wanted to help you test this thing. And the military was like, well, you've done other things for us, so why is it that I guess it would make sense to at least say what you do. And then he's just like, blow up this vehicle. Okay. Then they try studying the remains. And then it's just like, okay, bring out the next one, we're going to do the test. Blow it up again! It's like, we've already gotten that test done. And it's just like, we don't have that many of this vehicle. We can't keep blowing them up to complete annihilation. We need to test to make sure this. And he's just like, no, use more anti-tank rounds. And it's like, this is a vehicle that's not meant to take on tank rounds. It's meant to move and, deploy troops, attack, and it's not meant to go head-to-head with a tank in close combat. So it's not meant to have that much armor. Let's put it this way. If you try to there's a difference between commuting to a place by a bicycle as opposed to commuting to a place in a Hummer. A Hummer is way too big for what you need. So you need things to suit certain roles. If a vehicle does not need a lot of armor, you don't put a ton of armor. Even Even tanks don't survive anti-tank rounds. And they're designed to survive, to be able to take more hits. So a light armored vehicle that's meant to only take, shots from regular soldiers not equipped with anti-tank weaponry, of course it's going to cost. I'm talking too much. The reason I didn't comment too much in the previous video is I didn't want to
while demonstrating to its high command
waste too much time.
29 missile, which refused to lock onto its target. This episode was described by the famous Soviet test pilot Vladimir Gandaurov in his book. But before we dive into this hilarious story, I want you to learn one word in Russian. I bet most of you know some Russian words like "привет", "на здоровье", "бабушка", "балалайка", and judging from the average age of my audience, even such words as "perestroika". However, those are just simply words with only one straightforward meaning. Meanwhile, there is one word that I recommend you learn, which carries a far richer and a broader meaning, and in a way may help you better understand Russia and even some historic events, whether of today or 100 years ago. This word is smikalka. If translated from Russian to English literally, the closest meaning would be the word savvy, except it wouldn't be 100% correct, and here is why. The English dictionary describes the word savvy as a practical understanding, shrewdness or intelligence, especially in practical matters, common sense, and it is exactly the latter definition which could not in any way be applicable to the Russian smikalka. Which is why, when translated to English and taken into consideration the Russian reality, arguably the closest to the proper meaning of smikalka would be freaking dumb, especially when it comes to the so-called Russian military smikalka. Basically, smikalka means the ability of a person to find a smart solution in a difficult situation. To be fair, there is nothing wrong with that by itself, which is why words like savvy are present in many languages. However, what makes smikalka different in comparison to similar words is that in Russia it is praised to the highest possible extent on a very cultural level. The thing is that finding a good solution makes ordinary Russian people think of themselves as very smart and even unique. And such a self-perception is extensively cultivated and supported by the Russian leadership, because while
shit, we didn't provide our soldiers with anti-tank weapons. We have to do something, otherwise in a real fight they will all be killed.
Ordinary Russian people forget to question their leadership about how they ended up in that difficult situation.
While those sissy capitalists may require bazookas to destroy tanks, you, comrades, have learned to fight tanks using only hands and smikalka.
It doesn't make any sense, so let me...
You are the smartest soldiers in the world.
On this video, soldiers that are about to be sent to the war.
That's why I was just reading a little comic thing he had going.
In Ukraine, learn with surprise that the Russian army will provide them with only a uniform, while the rest of the military equipment they should take care of themselves.
So the thing that says is like 1 second.
Military equipment they should take care of
So no one is going to provide us with that equipment?
themselves.
All of that is your responsibility, boys. Your uniform is all that the army gives. Bulletproof vests and all this and that related to military equipment? We don't have any of it. Our men equip themselves. Same with medicine. Guys, please don't laugh. Ask your wives, girlfriends, mothers for feminine pads. Just the cheapest ones, and also the cheapest tampons. Do you know what tampons are for? Bullet wound. Just insert it right in the wound. It then starts to swell and press against the edges of the wound. Guys, get this and that med kits. Guys, please take care of yourselves on your own.
Had this video appeared in a normal society, the very least reaction would be resentment about such a barbaric attitude towards your soldiers. Meanwhile, in Russia, the main thing they see in the video is a smart solution in a difficult situation. While in a normal society, such a video would certainly raise big questions about your leadership, For the Russians, the video only reaffirms the supremacy of the Russian mindset. I mean, how would you otherwise explain the fact that no other army in the world has come up with such an elegant solution of using tampons for wound treatment? For the Russians, the explanation is obvious. It is military smikalka. And Russian history is full of such examples of military smikalka, which in essence are simply freaking dumb and tragic, because the outcomes of their seemingly smart solutions are at best useless, but most of the time are simply harmful to their own interests. But today I want to tell you the story of a rare smikalka example which was actually hilarious and quite amusing. It is the story of the Ha-29 missile and its 1979 trials.
Video killed the radio star.
In the mid-70s, Soviet ground attack aviation was facing a big problem. The actual ground attack component was seriously complicated due to the lack of a capable precision-guided weapon. The thing is that the recently adopted Soviet air-to-ground missiles like Ha-23 and Ha-66 appear to be relatively weak for the efficient destruction of an enemy's frontline targets, such as command posts, bunkers, bridges, depots, etc. This part of the problem, however, was relatively easy to fix and could be solved by simply increasing the explosive's weight in the missile's warhead. The hard part was guiding the missile to the target. The thing is that until then, the precision-guided air-to-ground missiles were primarily radio-controlled. To put it simply, the pilot would first have to find and visually identify the target, launch the missile, and then, while visually tracking the flight of the missile, would manually guide it towards the target using the radio control system in the cockpit. The drawback of such an approach, other than its poor accuracy, was that the pilot had to simultaneously guide the missile and control his aircraft while flying towards the target. That, in turn, meant exposing the plane to anti-aircraft defenses, whose capabilities had developed significantly, and thus there was a huge risk of the pilot being shot down while guiding the missile to the target. One of the possible solutions to this problem would be the so-called fire-and-forget missiles. After their launch, such missiles did not require further external intervention, so the pilot could turn away his aircraft back to safety and would not need to enter the danger zone. Unfortunately, radio guidance could not deliver that. What could was video.
The
Or the
radio
television
star.
guidance system, to be precise. The problem, though, was that back then this TV system didn't exist and was yet to be developed. That is, it hadn't yet been developed in the USSR, since the French and British, as well as the Americans, had already tested and even tried in action TV-guided bombs and missiles. Put simply, television-guided missiles use an optical contrast seeker for their guidance. Such missiles have a video camera in the nose that transmits a grayscale image to the screen in the cockpit, so the pilot can locate, identify, and then lock the missile onto a high-contrast target. A huge advantage of TV guidance is the fact that after the launch, the missile will guide itself towards the target, thus leaving the pilot free to maneuver the aircraft and, if needed, avoid or evade possible threats. Also, since the missile is guided to the contrast image saved in the missile's memory, the missile is resistant to various electronic jams. However, TV guidance' primary advantage is at the same time the very reason for its main flaw. Its accuracy is highly dependent on the visibility of the target, meaning such missile can't be used at nighttime or in harsh weather conditions or when anything else makes the target less visible. Even simple smoke from explosions on the battlefield or just the camouflage of the target can seriously confuse the missile seeker, causing it to lose the target lock or even accidentally lock onto another high-contrast object in the vicinity of the intended target instead. Such a drawback is typical to pretty much any existing TV-guided weapon, and the Soviet Ha-29 air-to-surface missile wasn't in any way an exception either.
Goodbye,
The
Yellow Brick
Soviets'
Road.
intense work in the 70s on developing improved air-to-ground weaponry resulted
Also, I'm sorry for randomly saying or reading certain things. It's in case somebody's just listening to this video while, doing something else.
in the appearance of the new Ha-29 missile. In comparison to the previous Ha-23 missile, the Ha-29's warhead was 3 times heavier and was capable of causing serious destruction. For instance, when attacking concrete runways, the missile left a crater in the ground with a diameter of 15 meters and about 6 meters deep. A huge advantage of the new missile was its modular design. A simple change of the warhead could switch the missile to either television or laser guidance. However, laser guidance still required highlighting of the target, whether by the pilot himself or by someone on the ground in close proximity to the target. In contrast, the TV version of the missile was capable of utilizing the needed fire and forget principle. Kind of. As Vladimir Kandaurov recalled when working on the MiG-27K, which was supposed to become the most advanced ground attack aircraft in the Soviet Air Force, he was also involved in trials of the new armament, in particular the trials of the Ha-29 air-to-surface missile. As he recalled, the new missile was great. It was big, it was powerful, and could accurately hit even the smallest target, like you could aim not at the building, but at a particular window of that building. That was possible, however, only if the missile could properly lock on the target, which the Ha-29 had some big issues with. To be fair, having and fixing issues with new weaponry is not at all unusual. All in all, this is exactly the reason test pilots and engineers exist. However, the initial troubles with the Ha-29 were a little bit too much even for such an experienced test pilot as Kandaurov. What made things worse was that on top of the technological issues, there were also some other unique complications. As Kandaurov wrote in his book, one day he was called to his commander, who ordered him to fly to one of the shooting ranges to take part, as he said, in the big show, which was supposed to be the demonstration of the new types of aircraft armament to the Soviet High Command. Kandaurov honestly replied that the Ha-29 was still in a raw condition, and its level of readiness was such that just a simple smoke left on the firing range from the preceding performer could completely blind the missile seeker and thus ruin the show. This is why you go there and figure something out on the spot, replied his commander, demonstrating the highest level of mastery of the drop responsibility on someone else's skill. After arriving at the firing range, Kandaurov reported to General Lev Supran, the deputy chief commander of the Soviet Air Force, who was responsible for the overall organization of this new weapons demonstration. The entire range is camouflaged in a natural green color, explained General. We want to test our new weapons, including the Ha-29 missile, in close to real conditions. Your task is to destroy the plane inside the hangar. Do you think you can hit the hangar's gate? Asked the general. Kandaurov honestly replied that there was going to be a big problem. He had already made a test flight over the range and found that the Ha-29 seeker couldn't lock on literally anything in that sprint greenness. What? This is utterly unacceptable. How dare you say this to the second highest commanding officer of the Soviet Air Force? Such a defective missile shouldn't be demonstrated at all then, would have said the general in any normal country.
I got excited for a second.
Any ideas what to do? Asked General Supran instead. Paint the hangar's gate yellow, suggested Kandaurov. I don't know what you call the number, which just by the tiniest fraction is bigger than zero, but this number would perfectly describe the probability of NATO painting all their military objects yellow in case of war with the Soviet Union. However, for the Russian military Smikalka, that was not of any importance at all. The next morning, General Supran approached Kandaurov on the airfield and told him in a conspirational tone not to worry because the previous night the matter had been taken care of, exactly as Kandaurov had asked, and even better. Kandaurov relied on the general's words, jumped in the cockpit of the MiG-27, took off and headed to the shooting range. At the scheduled time, he entered the zone and started his combat approach, anxiously looking for a yellow spot among the greenness on the firing range. As he recalled later, to his surprise, it wasn't that easy, and he had already started getting nervous since he was almost out of time when he finally noticed some bright spot ahead of him and started preparations for the missile launch. And the missile seeker, though, stubbornly refused to lock on the yellow spot. After a few unsuccessful attempts, he managed to get a weak lock and just shot the missile in that direction, hoping for the best. He swiftly turned his aircraft to the right while watching on screen the flight of his missile. The missile was quickly approaching the target, and soon he saw on the screen how the bright spot formed into the hangar's gates, which were quickly getting bigger and bigger in size, but then all of a sudden the missile's crossbar started to go down away from the gates and switched to a bright road in front of the hangar. Kandaurov just helplessly watched as his missile's lock went further down the road and hit the ground in front of the hangar, leaving both the hangar and the aircraft inside untouched. As he later recalled, he was stunned and confused, and while flying back to the airfield, he was vigorously trying to figure out where the heck that bright road had appeared from right in front of the hangar. He learned the answer right after landing. General Supran, who was waiting on the airfield, told him that they had been worried about Kandahar, and so at night they had made a yellow sand road leading to the hangar so to help him and his missile find the target. Unfortunately, to the Ha-29 missile seeker, the yellow sand appeared to be brighter and more distinct than its surroundings, thus making the missile lock on the sand road instead of the hangar. I don't know how General Supran came up with the idea of the yellow sand road, but I can't help but thinking that in May 1979, at the exact same time, the famous Elton John was visiting the USSR with his show, which in particular included the well-known song Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Anyway, this fail didn't stop the development and trials of the Ha-29, and eventually the missile was accepted into service in 1980. The Ha-29 was then widely used and exported to all the countries that were operating Soviet-made aircraft, and eventually became the most common and popular Soviet and then Russian-made missile in the world. The Ha-29 is still in service, and in particular the Russians often use it against Ukraine. I don't have the exact answer to why the sophisticated and expensive Ha-29 missile, when attacking, as the Russians say, targets of strategic importance, also hits ordinary outdoor toilets. Maybe it's just a coincidence that happens again and again. Maybe it's just because almost 17 million households in Russia don't have a normal indoor toilet. Thus, the Russians consider all toilets as targets of strategic importance. Or maybe it's some weird technological glitch that makes the Ha-29 forget its target and go back to its roots and follow a yellow sand road that sometimes happen to lead to an outdoor toilet. When I mentioned earlier that Russian history is full of such examples of military smikalka, I wasn't exaggerating by any means. Cases of military cheating similar to the Ha-29 had been happening in Russia not only in the branch of aviation, but also in the Navy and ground forces. They have been happening during peacetime as well as in the hardest days of World War II. They involved ordinary Russian people as much as the top Soviet leadership, such as Nikita Khrushchev, for instance. If you want to know more, watch my video about a few other cases of the Russian military cheating, now available on my streaming service Nebula. Nebula is a place where top educational creators like
So yes, you should check out Nebula if you find his content interesting.
mastered real-life lore, not just bikes and many others, upload new videos every day, and where you can enjoy watching videos without any ads or sponsor messages. Since recently, along with access to amazing educational content from your favorite creators, you also get free access to Nebula classes, where those creators teaching you how they create and how to be, a successful creator. This is something I wish existed when I started my own YouTube journey. However, the best part of Nebula, if you ask me, is that it's a unique place where you can watch exclusive content, made possible because creators of Nebula don't need to worry about censorship that can demonetize your video for simply saying a few words that YouTube may consider as potentially shocking for the audience. This is exactly what happened to my video about a small airplane crash in Paris. I don't want this to happen again to any of my future videos, especially considering that I have big plans for the year 2023, in particular to make new videos more often as well as start a second channel. If you have ever considered supporting my work, then watching my videos on Nebula would be one of the best ways to do that. So join me on Nebula, click the link below and get a Nebula subscription with a special discount for fans of Paper Skies. Do that now and I will see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.
All right. Thank you so much for, well, only one person came, but still I appreciate you coming by. If you liked the video, or the two videos I watched, rather than following me, you should follow and support Paper Skies. I don't know if I'm going to stream again at this time, because, or at least until there's a break or a holiday or something when more people are available to watch. Because I'm trying to get my average viewer up, and I had been doing pretty well at keeping it to 2 to 3. The last few videos, with the exception of like I had done, have managed to get 3 or more viewers on average. So, you know, that's good. But this one just brought the average down by a lot, since I only had one viewer. Thanks again, and I'll try streaming later, a game later. Alright, bye. Bye-bye.